Washington, D.C.
Tonight, law by default, a bipartisan housing bill set to become law at midnight without the signature of President Trump. The affordability measure marking a rare point of agreement here in Washington and a potential campaign trail win for lawmakers up for re-election. But President Trump is withholding his signature in protest, instead urging Congress to pass his Save America Act. And election integrity. In his latest move to reshape the voting process, President Trump clears out remaining members of a key federal elections agency, leaving it with no sitting commissioners only months before the midterms. We'll discuss what this move means for election integrity with Larry Sabato of the University of Virginia Center for Politics. Plus, still talking, the U.S. will continue talks with Iran, according to the president, after 2 days of renewed strikes between the two nations, even as Trump reiterates the ceasefire is over. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Kaylee Lyons has the night off. This evening, a big win for the so-called Big Yawn. A bipartisan housing bill that President Trump is refusing to sign out of protest is now just hours away from becoming law at midnight. It's the same high-profile bill that was set for a major signing ceremony until Trump decided he wanted no part of it, insisting that his controversial voting bill, the Save America Act, should come first. With us now for all that and more is Bloomberg White House correspondent Jeff Mason. He's live on the North Lawn. Jeff, is the president simply trying to punish his own party?
You know what? I think he's trying not to attach his name to something that he's just not entirely behind. And yet he also didn't veto the bill, which would have created even more problems for his party and certainly caused an uproar on Capitol Hill. But he has made clear since the day, and I appreciated your referencing that yawn, he has made clear since the day that I asked him about it in the Oval Office, and he said it was a big yawn, that this is just not something he was excited about, or certainly not as excited about as the Save America Act, which would restrict voting access around the country, in which he just doesn't have the votes for within the Senate.
I need to ask you about Iran today, an important post from the president, Jeff. We're just all still trying to understand it. He said, on one hand, that the U.S. has agreed to continue talks with Iran, but that officially the ceasefire is over. Not unlike what he said while he was in Turkey at the NATO summit this week. Where do talks stand?
You're absolutely right. Not unlike what he said in Turkey, and certainly leaving more ambiguity in this entire conversation about where things are going with Iran. I think it's not unnotable, though, to use a double negative, that he's saying this today on a Friday that the ceasefire is over. Because just yesterday, a White House official made clear to me and other reporters that technical talks were continuing. He, of course, underscoring that as well by saying that talks are going to continue, but taking away any ambiguity about whether or not the back and forth attacks that we saw this week were just a minor skirmish or something that might go away quickly. If he says the ceasefire is over, then that means he believes the U.S. military has the right and the space to just continue attacks going forward. And that is certainly a very strong signal to Iran that that MOU has basically been thrown into the trash.
Jeff, the Election Assistance Commission suddenly has no commissioners. The president removed the two Democratic members of this bipartisan federal agency that's charged with helping state and local officials essentially run their elections. The remaining two Democratic members were fired and a Republican was allowed to resign. What's the president aiming for here?
You know, we were talking about war with Iran, but the president has also really been at war with U.S. elections since the 2020 election, which he falsely claims he won against Joe Biden. And he has made a habit or a point for years now of trying to suggest that the U.S. electoral system is beset by fraud. Evidence does not support that claim, but he is on a mission to change the U.S. electoral system. And now he has some additional powers, thanks to the Supreme Court's ruling at the end of June, which I think was just last week, time is flying, in the Slaughter case, which allowed him to, or gives him the power to fire people on independent agencies. And he applied that power with these two firings that you're referencing, and it's just part of a broader move by this president to take on elections and to try to recast them and recast the rules in a way that critics say is meant to help him and his party.
Well, Jeff, it's Always great to have you. Bloomberg's Jeff Mason live at the White House on our Friday edition of Balance of Power. Have a great weekend, Jeff. Joining us now to talk about this and a lot more, Democratic Congressman Emanuel Cleaver of Missouri. He's a member of the House Financial Services Committee and ranking member of the Housing Subcommittee. Congressman, it's good to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I'd like to tick through all of these issues, and we'll start with housing because you were instrumental in helping to develop the 21st Century Road to Housing legislation. And I'm guessing that you were planning to be in Statuary Hall for the signing ceremony that the president canceled. Do you care if he signs this or not? It becomes law at midnight either way.
It would have been nice if he had signed it. But my Republican colleague, Mike Flood, and I started doing this almost 2 years ago. 2 years ago. And I didn't think anybody thought at the time that it was going to go anywhere. But we continued to work, and I came to the conclusion that he was a good guy to work with, and he apparently thought I was a good guy to work with. And we started this legislation. It's actually a compilation of 50 different pieces of legislation. The president, as we were winding down on our work and getting ready to have a hearing on it, was complimentary and talked about how great this would be for the American public, and so therefore there was a little shock, and I think maybe from some of the Republicans there probably was some resentment that the president would then turn around and say that it's a yawn, that in other words, it's boring, and that he has no desire to participate in it, in spite of the fact that this is, without a doubt, a Republican or a Democrat would answer this, would say the same thing. It is the most consequential housing legislation in over almost a half century. And we thought that it would be great for the American public and for democracy, people all around the world, to see that the Republicans and the Democrats could work together, bringing in the public, because we held hearings and had people coming in from all over the country, and that they were able to move this major piece of legislation, and then Donald Trump throws water on it. I don't know who's advising him in the White House, but this was some bad advice. But nonetheless, at midnight, in just a few hours, this bill will become law.
It sure will. And I know, to your point, a lot of time has gone into this. Congressman, this is a personal project for you, and it comes with its critics. The president says it's a big yawn. Some have pointed out that it doesn't have the teeth that it had in its earlier versions, that build to rent, for instance, came out of the bill, and some of the institutional single-family home buying that has been talked about isn't actually as widespread as some people think. Tell us how quickly your constituents can see the benefits of this bill.
Well, first of all, the legislative process means that this bill will go to the appropriate committees that handle certain sections of it. Some of it will go, for example, to EPA. The majority of it will go to HUD. And then they have to do what we call rulemaking. And so that goes into the kind of general language that we put in the legislation to very specific language and requirements. But there are some things that we feel good about. I mean, the institutional housing is something that's not that widely done. I think that about 3% of the housing in the United States is owned by major corporations. But the president actually was one of the main spokespersons saying, well, housing is for people, not companies. And so it found its way into the bill late. And so remember, we made adjustments, and the only way we're going to function as an effective legislative body is if we work together. It means that we have to compromise, and you're right. There are some things that we had in the bill that Chairman Tim Scott and Ranking Member Elizabeth Warren didn't like. And so we went back and forth with them. Look, nobody should expect a successful legislative body if everybody has their way. I mean, we have to compromise. And so what has happened is we've got a German chocolate cake cut up with 2 people in the House, 2 people in the Senate, And what happens is all of us took a slice, and we believe we got the larger piece of the pie. The truth is, we all, lost a little that we wanted, and that's just unfortunately for people who want, perfect legislation. That's not. There will be no perfect legislation passed in the United States of America. That won't happen. Mm-hmm. There will be legislation that we try to get as close to perfection as we can, while at the same time not alienating people whose support we need for legislation to pass.
Well, Congressman, if I can move to another topic, you've been, of course, an advocate for election rights, voting rights, and election reform for the balance of your career. And the president's move today on the Election Assistance Commission seems meaningful. He removed the two Democratic members, the two Democratic commissioners, and allowed the Republican to resign. There are no commissioners on this panel now. This is the body that helps state and local officials run their elections. And it seems to be the latest move that the president is making in gearing up to the midterm elections. What do you think he's aiming for here? What's he up to?
Maybe two things. One is changing the discussion. And so with all the euphoria over this almost magical legislation we've gotten through, I think the president will have to go in some other direction to get attention. And this certainly has gotten attention because what it does more than anything impactful, I mean, this is an advisory committee. So what it does is that it continues to send out a message, albeit incorrectly or incorrect, that our elections are being jeopardized by people who are dead, who are voting, and people from other countries are voting. I mean, everybody's heard it all, and so just firing these individuals will cause some people to think, well, boy, this must be really, really awful, and so as a result, he continues to get some people, I don't think the majority, but he's getting some people who will say, well, it must be really bad out there. When you look at the number of people who tried to commit crimes by voting illegally, it is minuscule. And some of the things the president's talking about, less than 1% of the public or voters tried to do some of the things he's out talking about. And we're talking mail-in ballots. Look, the president has done it, mail-in ballots. He and his family. It's something that in the past, Republicans had a very good operation, at least here in Missouri. I mean, they had a mail-in ballots down. None of us thought they were cheating. They were just good at getting the ballots out to seniors.
Do you think the president gets his Save America Act? Because that appears to be the next chapter here, right?
Yeah, he doesn't have the votes to get that going. I mean, I think he's going to continue to beat those drums, but he doesn't have the votes for that. And I think most members of Congress don't want to continue to send the signal to the American public and to the people around the globe that somehow there's something illegal and sinister going on when we have elections. The president's really not involved in this. The elections are run by states. And so right. In some ways, this is meddling, and it's dangerous meddling because there are people who are thinking, well, he's the president of the United States. He must know what he's talking about. He doesn't. And I think he's dangerous as it relates to this voting thing because we have, by even Republican accounts, one of the safest election systems on planet Earth. And the president just doesn't like it because he lost an election to Joe Biden. And he's got to find a reason for having lost that election, other than he was just beaten by Joe Biden.
Well, it's good to have you back, Congressman. I appreciate your insights on all these issues. Congressman Emanuel Cleaver with us live on Bloomberg. We thank you. We turn to breaking news now coming from the tech world. Apple is suing OpenAI, alleging trade secret theft. This is a massive development. It came out after the markets closed just a short time ago. Luckily, we have Bloomberg Tech's Ed Ludlow with us from world headquarters in New York for a special breaking edition of Power Moves. Ed, what can you tell us? All right, we're going to get with Ed in just a moment. As this crosses the terminal, Apple suing OpenAI for trade secret theft. They're accusing the company here of a coordinated campaign to steal information about upcoming products. Apple saying OpenAI encouraged its employees to share information, components, drawings, and other materials related to upcoming products to develop its own suite of devices. We're looking at Apple shares after hours down fractionally, and Ed Ludlow joins us right now. Ed, what else can you tell us about this?
It's a big one, and that is the umbrella overview. More specifically, Apple has named OpenAI's chief hardware officer, Tang Tan, who is a former Apple executive, as a defendant, and basically is alleging a coordinated effort in a number of guises by OpenAI to obtain confidential information about unreleased Apple products. They say that there was an effort by OpenAI to recruit Apple employees and then encourage them to bring with them confidential information that related to future products, technologies that Apple had not yet released. And in terms of what Apple is seeking, they want a jury trial. They want an order requiring OpenAI to stop the alleged misuse of that trade secret and information. But they also want OpenAI to go further, to destroy any materials that they have that would constitute Apple proprietary information. They want OpenAI to redesign any upcoming OpenAI hardware products that were, as Apple would allege, including or incorporating Apple's technology. And for what it's worth, Joe, OpenAI has not responded to Bloomberg's request for comment, but you would say that this is a dramatic change of what was already a souring relationship between the two.
Wow, this is really something. Of course, OpenAI works with a lot of companies. Ed, I have to ask you, without knowing the answer, if these two have a relationship to the extent that, for instance, Microsoft might with OpenAI, that NVIDIA has with OpenAI. What's the history?
We know the answer. 2 years ago, when I was at Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference, Sam Altman was in the audience, and Apple, specifically their software chief, Craig Federighi, heralded OpenAI as the market leader, and they announced work together on the software side. They've never disclosed any relationship on the hardware side, but as Mark Gurman of Bloomberg News have reported in the last year or so, the relationship had soured on the OpenAI side, because OpenAI had felt that Apple was not integrating the technology and moving forward with the relationship in the way they had expected. Now, the opposite. Apple has come out with a very strong allegation of trade secret theft, and, you know, through the Northern District of California, filed suit. So that's the background.
Isn't this something? Ed, thank you. I've got to ask you what you originally were set to join us to talk about. An important new listing today, SK Hynix. We saw it coming days out. This, of course, is not just a chip maker, but part of a small class of memory chip makers a la Micron. Now we've got another one here in the U.S., and it looks like it went pretty well. Yeah,
it's the biggest first-time U.S. share sale by a foreign company. They were able to raise $26.5 billion, and the stock closed at about a 13% premium to where, 14% premium to where the ADR's price. But what you need to know from the extended interview we had with the SK Group chairman, Che, there is a massive commitment, or there will be one, to America. You know, right now, SK Group has about $35 billion of commitments to the U.S., and what Chairman Che told me is that that will turn into a much bigger number. And I tried to get him talking about his relationship and the company's relationship with this Trump administration, but he pledged that investment's coming. The whole reason for doing the U.S. listing was to get this company that's at the heart of the AI trade, 57% market share of high bandwidth memory, the core memory that goes into data centers for AI, but get in front of Americans from a talent perspective, from a public relations perspective, not just the function of raising money, but boy, did they need it.
Boy, really something. You talked to the CEO as well, Ed. 2030 was the year we got, right? I'm out of time, but that's important for investors as this turns from a cyclical company apparently to something different. Yeah, longer than others have said. That's all you need to know. Longer than the others in industry have said this will last. Fascinating. Ed Ludlow, thank you, sir. You've had a busy day. He's a news machine, and we appreciate your being with us. Coming up, we'll have more breaking news. This out of Maine. Graham Platner formally withdraws from the Senate race. This just happened, opening the door for another candidate to take his place. Larry Sabato and his crystal ball are up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington with breaking news tonight. Just days after announcing he would be stepping down from his Senate race following allegations of sexual assault, it is now official. Democratic nominee Graham Platner formally withdrawing from the race, announcing the news via X with just hours until Monday's deadline. But who will Dems pick now to succeed him? Do they have a fighting chance to take back the Senate? Joining us to answer some of these questions is Larry Sabato, the founder and director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia. And it's great to have you back, Larry. Must be election season. Now that it's official, I'm wondering your thoughts, if it matters even who the candidate is on the Democratic side, or will this race be decided by President Trump's approval ratings and whomever scores last, as it were, in Washington?
Well, certainly Trump's approval ratings will have a lot to do with it, and he is not popular in Maine. And he's lost it repeatedly, though he did get that one electoral vote from the more conservative congressional district in Maine. They split their votes. But look, let's see who the Democrats pick. They're up to about 10 candidates, either announced or seriously considering it. So you know one thing for sure, the vote's going to be split. And given what Maine Democrats have shown us recently, I don't think you can assume that they're all going to join back together and sing Kumbaya. So if there are divisions in the party after this disaster, this fiasco with Platner, clearly Susan Collins would be favored in that case. If Democrats can come back together and enthusiastically back whichever candidate is chosen, then they have a chance given the underlying fundamentals in Maine.
Well, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this shotgun convention that's being put together. They've got less than 3 weeks to do it, and we got candidate qualification requirements today. They need to go get signatures, 500, at least 50 from no fewer than 8 counties. And Maine is a big state that requires a lot of driving to get all this done, plus any additional signatures totaling 1,000 to qualify for the nominating convention. They also put out the form to actually sign up to file to be a candidate, Larry, and it's got an essay question on it, no longer than 300 words. Tell us why you should be the candidate. This is like something out of grade school. It's got like 10 lines. I need my crayon to write this here. I don't know if they're going to use AI to fill this out, Larry, or if this is simply an attempt to make people feel like it's a credible process.
Well, they don't want to repeat what happened with Kamala Harris, obviously, with Joe Biden stepping aside at the last minute, making it impossible, really, for the Democrats to have an actual selection process. So they want this to be a selection process. That form makes me think that they're going to be issuing grades and that this will go on the permanent record card. I don't know that it's the way to proceed, given everything that they've had happen, though I do think they're wise to make sure they make a distinction with what happened with Kamala Harris.
That said, Democrats aren't going to have a lot of time to identify their candidate. There's going to be a surge of money into Maine on both sides here, right? Republicans, I can only assume, are going to start adding cash to this race to try to shut down whatever campaign is about to emerge.
And, you know, the media markets in Maine are relatively cheap, certainly compared to big cities. So it doesn't take that much to buy out all the available advertising space. And I suspect that's going to happen. Or maybe the shows will cut out minutes one way or another so they can make more money. But, yeah, I wouldn't want to live in Maine coming up for this fall. It's just going to be a deluge of TV ads.
I believe that. And are you of the conventional wisdom that if Democrats do not win Maine, the rest of this doesn't matter? They're not going to win the Senate.
Well, there's a path without Maine, but it's a much more difficult path. Maine was supposed to be the easy pickup for Democrats, and they've got another big problem coming in Michigan on August the 4th. They've got a Senate primary there, and it's been very divisive. And again, they're going to face the difficulty of joining back together when the candidates don't agree on some basic things. So good luck.
Boy, okay, so that said, where are the swing states tracking in your crystal ball? And do Democrats have a resonant message? Some would say it's socialism. The president would tell you it's communism. But is there more than a never Trump message for Democrats that you're sensing this cycle?
it's really about Trump. It's about Iraq. It's about affordability. But it's a negative message in the sense that they're running against the Trump administration. They're running against the policy results of Donald Trump. Whether that's enough, it probably will be in some states. And what's interested me is the easy ones. That is Michigan, which already is Democratic, and Maine, which is pretty heavily Democratic. They should be the easy ones, and they're turning out to be tough. Some of the difficult ones, like Ohio and Iowa and Alaska, actually seem more possible than some of the easy ones.
Wow.
So it's going to be another crazy election season, and that's good for you and me, Joe.
Well, I guess there's some kind of job security here. Larry, will, I guess, live by it, die by it. But I'm curious your thoughts on this move by the president today. This isn't making as much news as I thought it would. To clean out the Election Assistance Commission, he fired the 2 Democrats and let the Republican on the panel resign, which means there are no commissioners on this panel that helps to support state and local officials conduct their elections. Will it make a difference in November?
I've heard a lot of theories on this, and one place where it will make a difference is that commission did help many states and localities improve their voting process, better machines, better calculating equipment, and so on. And none of that money, I assume, is going to be available. So it's disturbing in some ways. In other ways, it may eliminate one of the options that are out there to make things more complicated. So I don't know what will actually happen with it. It probably won't be significant, but there are many suspicions that this is part of some gigantic Trump plan to take over the elections. I doubt it, but I'm open to all possibilities.
Well, sure gets the tongues wagging up here. And, we heard a lot about conspiracies as soon as that headline broke, Larry. I see you're paying $376 in the state of Virginia. That's where I live, too. Maybe you're less out in Charlottesville. But I'm wondering how you're factoring in. I think you said Iraq earlier. I'm guessing that you meant Iran. The price of gas and where that needs to be by Labor Day, if not lower than this.
Yeah, I just addressed a delegation from Iraq, so I apologize for that. But yes, for Iran, this war is unpopular, but it really has to do with gas prices and troops on the ground, although I doubt that's going to happen. Clearly, the news is not as good as Republicans had hoped it would. So we'll just have to watch and see. But affordability for other things is probably more central to this campaign. And that's what the Trump administration has to worry about. Why aren't the costs coming down? Why are they continuing to go up? You know some of the answers. I know some of the answers, but I don't know that the average American voter knows those answers and is going to be crazy about the answers.
Well, isn't that the truth? If I got in the car and drove down to pay you a visit, Larry, I'd go by a lot of data centers in Northern Virginia on my way. And I'm just hearing more and more about this all the time, to where even some Republicans are now backing the idea of a moratorium or taking some kind of a NIMBY stance, despite the president's embrace of AI technology broadly. In a state like Virginia or anywhere around the country where this is a trend, how big is this data center issue going to be in deciding elections?
It's becoming bigger. I'm surprised because I thought, at least in the beginning of this debate, that it would simply fade away and it would affect a relatively small number of people. It's not. It's really more widespread. And I just know from the traffic I'm getting, people writing and calling about it, complaining about it, that it's on voters' minds, and they generally vote what's on their minds.
Fascinating. Housing bill is apparently going to become law tonight, Larry, without the president's signature. I don't know that was in Schoolhouse Rock, but that's how it works. It's been sitting there for 10 days, and unless he vetoes it, it's going to be a law. To what extent is this a missed opportunity for the president himself and those in his party who wanted to take a victory lap?
It's a big missed opportunity. Really, Joe, this doesn't make any sense at all. It actually is a bill that does a lot of good, and it brings the two parties together, exactly what everyone's been accusing Trump of not being able to do. He could have really made some hay on this. But once again, he's hitting, the Save America Act, pass the Save America Act. The Save America Act is not going to pass. The votes aren't there. Just give it up or mention it in other contexts. You're cutting off your nose to spite your face.
Wow. I guarantee you, though, we're going to see lawmakers trumping this around. Well, maybe I should use a different word.
Yes.
They're going to be promoting this on the stump for the rest of the year, right?
Absolutely, and they should. They should. They actually accomplished something.
Larry, it's good to see you. Thanks for coming back on. That's Larry Sabato, of course. There's only one with us live on Bloomberg. Have a great weekend. We've got a lot more ahead on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg, so stay with us. I'm Joe Matthew, live in Washington, only on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington as we turn to a potential security scare that's gripping the nation's capital 48 hours after the president had to swap out his new Qatari-provided Air Force One jet to get home from Turkey, where he was attending the NATO summit. There are new questions about just how secure that new jet was. Former U.S. ambassador to Turkey, James Jeffrey, spoke with us on the early edition of Balance of Power. Talked about the incident some in the media are calling Scare Force One. Listen to this part of our conversation. Should that plane, the new Air Force One, be used at all?
No. I was in the old Air Force One with President Bush when a certain rogue East Asian state, I won't name which, took some threatening actions launching fighters. And under those circumstances, it's a life or death situation involving the president. We cannot take any risk with an American president being shot down or destroyed in a combat or in a terrorist operation. That thing should be sent to some graveyard.
Sent to some graveyard, he says. Now the New York Times is out with a report. It says the new Air Force One Trump was riding on, quote, lacks the same defensive countermeasures that were security features of the old model, including its advanced anti-missile capabilities, unquote. To discuss all that and more is Brian Gant, the former Secret Service and FBI agent, now Associate Dean of Technology, Assistant Professor, Cybersecurity at Maryville University. Brian, it's great to have you back. If this were up to you and you were advising the president, would you take an off-the-rack 747 from a foreign country?
Well, thanks for having me, Joe. I think the ambassador, had some key words there. In terms of whether I would let the president ride on the plane or not, I think everyone had an understanding that this particular model plane was going to be a bridge plane from the old Air Force One to potentially the new. And I think you have to rely on Secret Service, Homeland Security, and other intelligence reports of the destinations to really decide on the appropriate, level of transportation for the president. If the Secret Service or intelligence briefings deem that the capabilities of the plane are okay for that particular destination and the advanced team okays everything, I think it's perfectly fine. It's when you get into those situations of getting to places where there may be some intel that suggests that you may be compromised, that you may want to think about other means of transportation.
Man, well, without betraying any classified information about the airplane, can you give us a sense and maybe be our decoder ring on what exactly these reports are referring to? What does a military VC-25A, the old Air Force One, I know they're working on a new B version now, have that a normal Boeing 747 does not have?
Think about the old Air Force One. You have a plane that's been through a lot of different iterations. And what I mean by that is you have the time necessary to provide countermeasures, have infrared systems for missiles or weapons, things of that nature. You also have a plane that's been hardened, for different types of inbound or outbound flights. So when you look at the new plane, the time that was allotted for things to be switched out and it to be converted into something that's suitable to carry the president or any other head of state, there just wasn't enough time to do those types of things. And so, with the new plane, I'm sure it will have all of the same defensive countermeasures as the previous Air Force One. And whether that be Marine One or whether that be the Camp David package or whatever the president is being transported in, you want to make sure that it's appropriate for that type of particular site or that particular destination.
Are we talking like electronic countermeasures? Are we talking the ability to shoot chaff at a missile that's approaching the airplane?
Yes, we're talking about the whole kit and caboodle, right? Countermeasures, chaff, the ability to spoof missiles and things like that. So the full, complete security package, which you would expect, right? You would expect for a vehicle carrying the leader of the free world to have. So there has to be an appropriate level of communication with this bridge airplane, and in terms of places it can go and places that quite frankly, it shouldn't go.
Pretty remarkable that it was 2 years ago next week, Brian. I just heard this on my way into the studio that we first spoke with you following the attempt on the president's life, the then candidate Donald Trump's life in Butler, Pennsylvania. That, of course, was followed up by a congressional task force, reforms and budget changes at the Secret Service. But just this week, the president was in Turkey talking to the world about how he was the #1 name on Iran's target kill list. Is he safer now than he was in Butler?
I believe he is safer. I believe those appropriate defensive measures have been put in place. There's a long list of items within Homeland Security that I'm sure, the agency has went through to make sure that the president is in a safer spot. But we're in a world where, that's a zero-sum job, right? One thing can go wrong and you can have a fatality. So, when you think about all those types of things that need to be put into a security plan, whether it's the transportation or protecting him at open air rallies, different sites, those things are very important. The details of those things are very important. And it's also important for our White House staff and security to understand that the communication has to be there to protect them.
Interesting. I'd like to ask you lastly about this report in the Wall Street Journal that Israel shared new evidence, new intelligence with the United States showing a fresh kill plan by Iran, a plan to kill President Trump. The Israeli embassy in Washington declined to comment here, White House referring the paper to comments the president made already. When you hear a report like that, give us a practical sense of what that means. Do you believe there are assassination squads in this country?
Yeah, I think we would have to be pretty naive to think that there aren't assassination plots against the heads of state within our country, whether it be President Trump, President Bush, President Obama. The threat level has always and will always probably remain very, very high. We have those that see to do harm for whatever reason, whether it be for political reasons, whether it be for financial gain. So I have every confidence that the Homeland Security, the agencies that protect us abroad, Central Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, National Geospatial Agency, which we have right here in St. Louis, I have every confidence that those agencies are doing their due diligence and protecting the heads of state.
Brian, I'm glad you could join us this evening and I hope you have a great weekend. Brian Gant with us live on Bloomberg. Thank you. Earlier today, Spain's economic minister, Carlos Cuerpo, spoke exclusively with Bloomberg's Oliver Crook, and they talked about tensions between Spain and President Trump. Again, this came up at the NATO summit this week. Some tough words from the president, threatening to halt trade. Listen to the response.
There is no specific executive order or measure against any specific country within the European Union, but the Commission has been very clear also this week on the fact that they would, of course, always protect the interests of the Union and of each and every one of its member states. And again, trade is an European policy, European Commission policy, and I think a message to the business community as well. We want to give them predictability, stability going forward. So the reaction function somehow should be that we will make good on the agreement that we signed. From the European side, everything is set so that we can go on with it. We expect also the same from our US peers in the next few weeks. Let's give that positive message to businesses.
So maybe we're not breaking up. We return to our developing political news tonight. I've got a lot of headlines for a Friday. Hours from now, midnight, the bipartisan housing bill becomes law, with or without the president's signature, and he says he's not going to sign it. A federal election commission without any commissioners. And Graham Platner formally withdraws, giving Democrats a small window to find a replacement in Maine. Joining us now to tackle all of these stories, our political panel, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino is with us, along with Rick Davis, our Republican strategist, partner at Stone Court Capital. Jeannie is our Democratic analyst and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard's Ash Center. Great to see both of you. Rick, I'm going to start with the bipartisan housing bill because this does seem to be Republican on Republican violence here. Is this just a punitive president punishing his own party?
Yeah, that's all you can really stock this up to be. Yeah. It's a win for the party. It's a win for him if he signs it. Mm-hmm. He's not going to sign it. So he's just sort of kicking that win down the curb. But Republicans really wanted that ceremony at the White House. They knew that we would all cover it, and it would be a way of driving home the message that they just had this big win for consumers, for people who are in the housing market, and they're not going to get that now. So the probably the biggest accomplishment they've had in this Congress this year is going to go by Friday night with a whimper.
It's amazing. You talk about a Friday news dump, Jeannie. That's kind of the opposite of what you're supposed to do with a big win. Think of how many months we talked about not only bipartisan, but at last bicameral cooperation. They were fighting within the parties, across the aisle and across the rotunda. Either way, this becomes law now. How do lawmakers pull it out of the fire? Can't they all march in their own parade and talk about this bill when they go home?
Yeah, I think we're going to hear both sides talking about the bill. But I will tell you that this says a lot about who the Republicans are and Donald Trump as their leader. His priority is not affordability. It's not the economy. It's not inflation. It is not the cost of living. That's what his refusal to sign this bill tells us. In his own words, he said, I'm not going to sign this because you haven't passed my Save America Vote Act, or what, as we otherwise call it, the disenfranchisement bill. This is somebody who is prioritizing changing the rules of the electoral game, as he's tried to do since he got into office, over the affordability and cost of living for Americans. So it is not just a whimper and a nod. That's something that Democrats and Republicans should go talk about. It enforces or reinforces with the American public Donald Trump's lack of interest in the issue of affordability. Joe, I think he called the bill a big yawn, right? That big says yawn, it all.
Emanuel Cleaver didn't seem to agree when we spoke with him earlier. Jeannie, you must love what he's doing with the Election Assistance Commission. How about you, Rick? He's allowed the Republican to resign, and he fired both the Democrats on the panel here. Most Americans don't know what the Election Assistance Commission is, but it helps local officials conduct their elections, state and local. Is this just another brick in the wall on the president's view on American elections, or is this more significant?
Yeah, I think you can actually start wide, right? I mean, the president has had a disdain for these independent agencies. Mm-hmm. He's fought them in the Supreme Court. He won recently the Supreme Court decision to allow him to fire at will these commissioners. But Congress set this up. This was an act of Congress. That's right. It's a law that says that we ought to give assistance to the states to conduct good elections. Well, Donald Trump certainly has spent a lot of time talking about why states don't conduct good elections. So he had two choices. He could put new commissioners in there and encourage them to make sure that the elections go smoothly, or do what he did, which is basically shut it down. Wow. They won't be spending money. Good news is states still care about their elections, and they'll make up the difference in their own budgets to what this group did. But the Republicans and the Democrats on Capitol Hill should be furious because this is something they've passed into law, and now they're just having it shut down by virtue of the fact that there'll be no commissioner.
Amazing. Rick's right, Jeannie. It was created by Congress in 2002, and you can speak to this specific move, but this follows a pattern by the president, right? If you're not going to shut down the agency or the commission, just remove the commissioners and it's on ice.
Yeah, and of course, the Supreme Court's decision 10 days ago allows him to do that. And there is absolutely no squaring why the Supreme Court decided that it is okay for him to take these steps with some of these commissions and not, for instance, with the Fed. And what it has allowed the president to do is to continue to sow the seeds in the American public that our election administration is faulty, that you can't trust the results of elections. Again, this goes back to the Save America Act. From the time he has gotten into office, and especially since he lost the 2020 election, he has tried to do something that we see autocrats do around the world, which is to say, you can't trust these election results. And so it makes perfect sense that he would dismantle the only bipartisan federal commission on elections, which assists our election administrators, professional people around the country, as they do the most important thing we do in a democracy, which is vote. And this is all in advance of the midterm election, because Donald Trump knows, looking at 60% disapproval on the economy, he has no chance of winning unless he changes the rules of the game. Yeah. I heard somebody say, Joe, you don't usually change the rules unless you're losing. And so I think that sort of speaks volumes.
Well, let's go to Maine, because we need to talk about elections there. And we do have an important update, a breaking headline on this story involving Graham Platner. He's out with a letter. Jeannie, he posted it on X, and he has officially withdrawn from the race. Dated July 10 to the Maine Department of the Secretary of State, to whom it may concern, I write to formally withdraw my candidacy for United States Senate. He goes on to talk about the cause. I seek to further the movement we have built together. But he ends it with quite a line. I can't read it on the air. F ICE, free Palestine, up the hearts. He's still angry, Jeannie, but he's out of the race.
He's still angry.
What do Democrats do now?
Yeah, he's still angry. Good riddance. He is out of the race, and Democrats need to move forward and make sure they take his supporters along with him. I haven't had a chance to see that letter, Joe, but I certainly hope he is not once again attacking the Democratic establishment. I haven't read it yet, but that's what I would hope is not happening, because if he really wants the Democrats to beat Susan Collins, he's got to get his supporters to support whoever replaces him.
Let's have you open up on this whole thing, because you could argue that the contest just got more difficult for Susan Collins, or maybe not. Does it matter who Democrats pick?
Yeah, look, I mean, the Democratic Party of Maine, and to some degree the Democratic Party nationally, is a dumpster fire. Okay. Right? They're fighting on their left flank. They've got a major insurrection going on with socialists. They can't control that narrative. Now they've got their ideal candidate to, finally have someone to run against Susan Collins, someone they've been trying to beat for decades, and he blows himself up. Now there's a blame game. Oh, my God, I was never really for that guy before I was against him. And that will continue on, by the way. I mean, the Democrats are going to have a real comeuppance as to why they didn't do something about this sooner, while you try to find a nominee that can actually cut through all this noise and compete. This is great news for Susan Collins. Okay. Susan Collins, when she started this election, knew she was going to have a hard campaign. She fortified herself. She's campaigned hard. She's raised a lot of money. Her numbers are improving. She was beating Platner in the latest polls, not by much, but she had really come back a long way. Sure. And the Democrats still have a month to find a candidate and put them out on the road and try to raise money. It is a incredibly difficult prospect for Democrats, and nobody on the list so far that I've seen has had any success electorally in the state.
Wow, amazing! But this has just been a remarkable turn of events here, Jeannie. And now we got 10, 12 candidates who are already out there ready to duke this out in the next 2 weeks. There's going to be a shotgun convention. We've talked about that. Candidate qualification requirements are out today. You need to get signatures. And to Rick's point earlier, that means they'll all hire firms to go knocking on doors, I guess. And now we've got the form here to fill out if you want to actually be a candidate. We talked about this as well, Jeannie. You can write an essay here, no more than 300 words, as to why you should be the employee of the month. What kind of a process? Are we back in middle school? What are they going to write?
Well, I think I will confess, Joe, that I did put it into ChatGPT and I got an answer back. It was very generic. I absolutely did. It was very generic. And so I suspect we might get some of that. But, I do think we're seeing evidence that the party in Maine, which this has all been hoisted on, is trying their best to make sure that they are being open, that they are being transparent, and they are allowing the voters as much access to these candidates as they can have. I, for one. Hope there's a debate, Joe, and I hope we all go up to Maine.
Debate.
I'm for Bar Harbor myself, and we get to watch it in person.
All right. I'll meet you on the marginal wave outside of Barnacle Billy's. Rick, what do you think of this? Is everyone just going to put this into ChatGPT?
Yeah, anybody who spends any time on that is, they should be the nominee. I mean, we can ensure Susan Collins will win the election the minute they have to actually do that. No, I think it's great. And who's going to grade it? I mean, like, what is the usefulness of this? Can you actually fail this exercise and be disqualified?
Great question. That's right. You didn't make the
maybe
ballot.
you just go to, Platner's last line. F ICE, free Palestine. Put it on there and see what happens.
You might win the election. All right, so, look, you've managed a lot of campaigns. Have you ever seen anything? This is for a Senate race. You ever seen anything like this?
Look, every campaign, especially national campaigns, gets enormous amount of questionnaires from every interest group in America, right? And sometimes they are as basic as that can be. And frankly, you usually take the rule that I'm not filling out any of these, right? The minute you fill out one, you got to fill out them all.
Okay.
So you just bypass the process. I get what Maine is trying to do, right?
Yeah.
They're trying to look so responsive. They're trying to get out from under the mistakes they made with Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
But they can't correct the entire national party's headache on this
in 2 weeks.
In 1 2-week period. I mean, like, they are throwing a kitchen sink at this thing.
That's for sure. This is going to be wild to cover. You better stick with us. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano will help us find the way. I'm still eating oysters. I don't care what the rest of you say. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online, and we'll meet you back here next week on Balance of Power. Kaylee will be back. I'll see you here, too, only on Bloomberg TV and radio.